Welcome to C2G Talk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, C2G's Director of Communications, and I'm speaking today with Paul Watkinson, who has more than 20 years' experience in multilateral negotiations and action on climate and sustainable development issues. Mr. Watkinson served for many years as Chief Negotiator of France on international climate change issues and was a member of the steering committee of COP21, heading the climate negotiating team and contributing to the development of the Paris Agreement. He was also chair of the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for 2018 and 2019. And a member of the Bureau of the COP for those 2 years. As such, he worked closely with the other presiding officers to put together the package of decisions adopted in Katowice in December 2018 that constitute the rulebook of the Paris Agreement, as well as other decisions and conclusions to implement the Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. Welcome, Paul Watkinson.
Welcome. Thank you for the chance to talk.
So after 20 years in climate change diplomacy, what grade would you give our multilateral system in responding to the climate crisis?
So I think a very honest assessment has to give us a fairly low grade because we are still well off track. At the same time, we've given ourselves a significant number of tools to help us to get in the right direction. In particular, with the Paris Agreement, we have all countries in the world essentially on board in putting in place climate action. We, of course, had one major country, the United States, leave the Paris Agreement in the past few weeks, but in theory coming back in 2021. Of course, the level of action that countries are taking is still too low. But I think we've given ourselves a framework. The key thing is how to use it well, how to ramp up ambition, accelerate action, to give us a chance of keeping within those targets. And of course, to deal not only with the emissions, but also with the impacts of climate change, which are going to happen. They're already happening, and we will have to deal with.
And do you think your assessment is widely shared in terms of in the climate community, how people feel about what's worked, what hasn't worked in our climate system?
Well, I think I would be amazed to meet many of my colleagues who would say that we've achieved everything we could do and we're in a perfect situation. Of course we're not. We're in a situation where we're probably on track to at least 3 degrees of warming on the basis of current policies. The question is how to correct that, how to give us a chance of coming onto a much faster track. And I think the very interesting thing at the moment is we've seen a series of announcements, of course, the European Union looking very hard at how to get to an agreement on at least a 55% reduction by 2030 and carbon neutrality, climate neutrality by the middle of the century. We've had China make an announcement a couple of months ago on seeking neutrality by by 2060. Japan, South Korea, a number of other countries making similar targets. And of course, we're looking to a new US administration to come in. That makes a very interesting dynamic. What matters, of course, are the pathways and the policies we put in place in the next few years. That's where we've been far too weak. I think we have the framework to track, to follow, to work together, but we need to strengthen the action. I think that is the key challenge we've all been looking at. And that's about political will. It's about the decision to move forward. And that's why I think we need to build on this dynamic, and particularly the way in which the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis creates opportunities for investment in infrastructure, in new areas of technology and development and types of collaboration. It's an opportunity we can take or squander. And I think it's the taking it which is going to be the key test of what we achieve in the next few years.
And so given those dynamics that you've identified, what do you think the mood music, in a sense, will be during the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement this December?
Well, I mean, again, I think it has to be, how do we move forward? It has to be looking towards we're going. It's not the time to celebrate having adopted the Paris Agreement 5 years ago. The Paris Agreement is, in my view, a very, very important framework to help us to move forward. but it hasn't solved climate change. It wasn't the aim of it. It's saying we have to fill, and it's what we put in it. It's what each country puts in the Paris Agreement that makes a difference. It's raising the ambition for 2030 to put us on a pathway to climate neutrality. It's seriously getting to the climate neutrality by the middle of the century. Of course, we'll need to talk about moving beyond that to negative emissions, which I think is part of our discussion coming up. And of course, it's working together. It's the collaboration. It's the solidarity, in particular with those who are dealing with in the front line of the impacts of climate change, the most vulnerable, and in particular the poorest amongst us.
So you mentioned net negative emissions. Given insufficient action on emission cuts, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has noted in its reports that large-scale carbon dioxide removal is also needed to avoid catastrophic global warming. Why do you think there has been so little relative discussion of this so far?
I think the focus has to be whatever we use in terms of negative emissions technologies, the focus has to be on getting our positive emissions down to zero or as close to zero as we can. And I think it is vital that that is our starting point. If we tend to look, and maybe the Kyoto world, take us to some years ago, took us to a view we could put all emissions and absorptions on the same level. It doesn't matter where we reduce emissions or when. And if you're making a 5 or even a 20% reduction, that's probably a reasonable way of seeing it. If you're going to zero, you need every bit of your emission profile to go down. Your energy systems need to be decarbonized totally to produce electricity, to our transport system, housing. We just need to bring those down to zero. And we need to get there in the next few decades. We need to look at industry. Now, some industry we can go down to zero because it's primarily about the use of energy. Others, there are real challenges, particularly where there are process emissions involved. And of course, then there's agriculture, forestry, land use, which have the dual characteristic of being sources of emissions, and sometimes will be affected by climate change in the future, and that creates uncertainties, but also are sinks, which can absorb carbon dioxide. So we need each of these to come down. So I think the fact that we are focused on those reductions is vital. I think that is the starting point for this. The question is, how do we go beyond that? And I think the question now, particularly as we start to look to 2030 and into the 2030s and towards the middle of the century, is what is the space for negative emissions technologies and carbon dioxide removal as we start to think in a large scale. The IPCC is telling us we will need these technologies. How and when do we start to talk about their coming in, and which ones are ready? Which ones raise serious challenges, in particular trade-offs with other policy aims. We need to start to look at these in a serious way.
So how widely do you think this challenge that you laid out in terms of the balance of stopping emissions and then starting to remove CO2 already in the air, and what the IPCC has said about that, how widely is this understood, that there is this other part of the challenge and the sensitivities and complications around that, or are we really starting from quite a low level right now?
I think it's something which is becoming part of the conversation in a much wider way. As I said, if you go back to the type of conversations we were having 10 or 15 years ago with the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol, offsets were seen as something to balance what I can't reduce my emissions now, so I use an offset. That sort of logic is not the logic we need as we move down to net zero by the middle of the century, and then into net negative emissions. We will need to work out how we get everything to zero, and then how we take those negative emissions forward. I think that conversation has got to begin. I think it's been right that we have the focus first on the getting to zero. That remains the key objective. And the rest of it is meaningless almost if we don't do that. We can't do this as an offsetting of keeping our emissions high. How do we then start to see large-scale use of carbon dioxide removal? This is going to come on stream in 5-10 years in terms of how we need to start to see it. And so we do need this conversation, yes.
Do you think there's an issue with the word offset itself and the assumptions it brings with it?
I think it is the sense that you can avoid making reductions. We cannot avoid making reductions. We need to eliminate the emissions across as much of our economy as we can. There will be some non-compressible emissions in a few sectors. Particularly in some of the land use area, potentially agriculture, maybe in some industrial areas, although there are some ways we need to explore, particularly with process emissions, to see how we can bring those down as far as we can. The question then is, how do we go beyond that? And in particular, net negative emissions are not about offsets, they're about removal. And the type of conversations we've had until now, particularly about how we could finance or track or even incentivize these type of activities, are simply not adapted to literally drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, either mechanically or by large-scale biological means. They're taking us into new territory, and I think we need to sort of. It's a mind shift we need to take from the way we've handled this in the past to the conversations we need to be having in the future. I don't think we've made that shift yet, but we need to start preparing it.
So how ready now, or when might the UNFCCC process be ready to seriously consider large-scale carbon dioxide removal as part of the suite of activities?
I mean, I think if you're looking at timing of these issues, I still have to insist the priority for this year and the next few years is the reduction of emissions. That remains an absolute. And I think anybody who starts to put this forward in any other way is not helping our discussion. We need to get to zero. I think we've had a large number of discussions on this. This now needs to be the real focus, particularly cooperation between governments to set targets, implement policies, and take us forward. I think when we start to look how we can go beyond that, there are a number of points in the UNFCCC process where that could be picked up. It can be looked at from the work with the scientific community. When I was chair of the SBSTA, the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, I organized briefings with the IPCC on the special report on 1.5 degrees, their work also on land and climate change, where these issues were raised with parties because they're clearly part of the pathways we need to move forward. And in the next few years, we'll have the 6th assessment report from the IPCC on the table, in particular when we come in 2023 to the first global stocktake. Where are we? Where do we need to go? I think that's one of the places this conversation will start to be clear. We need to go to zero and beyond zero. And I think that point will be on the table and parties will have to think about it. How do we raise ambition and start to go down that way? We'll also need to think about it in terms of the tools and the rules that we have in place under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. Now, those have rightly been designed to track policies and emissions profiles as they are at the moment. And I think it would be unhelpful for us to try and shift that at this stage to think about the large-scale removal agenda. But I think in a few years' time, when we've had experience of running the Paris Agreement for the first few years, that would be a moment to look at how those rules apply when we move into larger scale use of carbon dioxide removal. I think by the mid-2020s, there's a point when we're supposed to come back to all of our transparency rules. 2026 or 2027, I think, I can't remember offhand. That could start to be prepared before then. But that's the point we could see, are we actually able to do the tracking and the verification we would need over time? And in particular, we could start to look at the type of tools we would need to incentivize actions of this sort. So I think there are stages we need to go through. I think we've got a priority at the moment, which is elsewhere. But I think these points can start to be prepared in the coming years.
And as we start to move towards those stages, as you described them, can you identify any sort of specific or unique challenges to carbon dioxide removal governance challenges that international decision makers are going to face, which perhaps new kinds of challenges or...
Yeah. Well, I think I can see a number of types of challenges. One of them I just touched on is a methodological one,
right?
Tracking, following. And I think we've probably got a lot of the basis we would need to do that. I think particularly when you look at the verification and permanence and so on, there are things people would need to look at in more detail. Are they really adapted? So those points can be worked on further, but I think there's a solid basis to extend them to the sort of challenges that carbon dioxide removal on a large scale would raise.
Yes.
But I think it picks up on several other types of challenges, which I put in particular about equity. And I see equity as being twofold here. One is a temporal equity, which is about when do we act? How do we manage this? Clearly, the longer we put this off, the more we're passing on the effort to future generations. That's part of this challenge. And we need to talk about that. And that, I think, comes to your question about when and how do we start this conversation. And I think there is a big equity issue there. Another side is an issue which is at the heart of our work under the Convention and the Paris Agreement for many years, which is geographical equity, equity between countries and within countries as well. Parties won't necessarily have the same capacity to adopt these measures. They won't necessarily have the same options. If we're looking at biological storage in forests or land, different countries have different potential. If we're looking at geological storage, capturing from the air, stocking underground, again, the simple potential is different. And there's a temptation to say, I'm going to go this way, but someone else is going to do the effort. That is something we will need to think about very clearly because it raises big equity issues. I cannot simply say, yes, this is very important, but someone else is going to solve it for me.
Yes.
We'll have to talk about that. And the final point is, I think, a set of issues where I think the different technologies, and they raise different challenges, and I think we'll have to talk about them separately. It's not carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions. Is it land-based? Is it using carbon capture and storage as well as land-based? Is it using it in direct air capture? And then even things like ocean and other fields. There are very different challenges, and they touch on many different areas outside the climate field. Clearly, if we look at large-scale bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, for example, we're looking at issues for food security. We're looking also at issues for human rights, particularly with local communities, indigenous peoples, and the impact of such policies on them. And there are other interactions too. Those will need to be looked at in a coherent way. There can be win-win solutions, but there can also be lose-lose solutions in some of these fields. Particularly if these technologies are not used in a sustainable and a long-term way. And we'll need to think about which technologies are ready over time. So I think there's a range of challenges which are coming forward. And some of them I think we can deal with already. Some of them we're talking about in different fora. I think the Convention on Biodiversity has touched on some of these in recent years. Other areas have thought about how to address some of these challenges, but we don't have a coherent way of doing so, and we certainly don't have a cross-cutting way of doing so, which has shown us a way forward.
So with that in mind, do you think there could be a role for some kind of, at least for the time being, for a while, a new international, informal, collaborative forum to start getting to grips with these issues, which bring together some of the key actors to talk about this?
Well, I can understand that it might be helpful. I don't have a view on it, and I'm expressing a purely personal position throughout this interview, obviously. But I think this is these issues need to be prepared. The scientific communities through the IPCC can give us the information on what options exist, what challenges exist. Other bodies such as IPBES can give us a view also from the biodiversity point of view. That's a very useful input, but it doesn't tell us how we might take it forward. So I can see that having spaces where we can explore this can be helpful. I don't think there's a single space where all of this will be handled. And I don't think the UNFCCC is the only space where this will be talked about. But I can see maybe, and I think the idea of a forum, if I understand it, is to have a sort of space where a number of key players can come together and link in to some of the different conversations which are moving forward. Sharing that information can undoubtedly be a helpful thing in the next few years to prepare some of the more complicated discussions in the formal fora which will be needed. I can see that as being something which could help us in preparing that.
And in those preparations, what kind of actors would need to be involved?
Well, clearly a number of actors from governments around the world would need to take part, since governments are the major actors, particularly in terms of regulation and action in this field. But it needs to involve civil society. It needs to involve representatives of different groups around the world who've got concerns about this. It needs scientific communities to feed in, to bring their expertise. And I can see quite a number of fora at a multilateral level, clearly the Climate Convention, but the Convention for Biodiversity, the different fora which are talking about oceans or management in those fields, areas talking about food security, the FAO, other fields in organizations in such fields. I can see many different actors have something to bring to this conversation. And quite often, the challenge is to get the right people around a table to have the right conversations. You can get the wrong people, and you can have a very interesting conversation, but it doesn't take you anywhere. And I think if there were a space which could bring some of the right people around the table, that could help to prepare some of the conversations which will go on in these different spaces then as they move forward.
So, for example, you mentioned CSO, civil society. What would constitute the right people in terms of bringing civil society on board for a discussion like this?
I don't think it's for me to say exactly how you can represent the whole of civil society. You can't. Right. Obviously, there are large-scale civil society organizations, but you also need to make sure you get a geographical balance within there. This affects countries in the north, in the south, and there are very different issues in large emerging countries, small island states, dealing with the interests of local communities, indigenous peoples' organizations, taking it from a gender perspective as well. You would want to bring different perspectives to bear. And I think it would need an effort to bring together a range of perspectives to ensure that they are reflected in the conversation. You can't have everyone around a table. You need to make some choices. But I think you need to work with these organizations to ensure that they take part and they come in to the debate. Simply inviting 2 or 3 representatives to be your civil society is not enough. You need to find a way of ensuring those different voices, youth, perspectives of different groups around the world can be heard.
So there's another set of ideas, the IPCC in AR5, SR 1.5, and also in the upcoming AR6 special report the AR6 is pointing to ideas to potentially reflect more sunlight back into space, broadly described as solar radiation modification or solar geoengineering. Are our systems and institutions able yet to start considering and taking decisions about these ideas? Do you have any specific insights into these ideas?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's important to keep separate conversations. I think for a long time we had a term of geoengineering where we put everything in there, and it's all the technologies and the challenges they raise are very different between the carbon dioxide removal and the solar radiation management type concerns. They take us into different fields and different types of challenges. there's one thing which links them, which is they are not substitutes for reducing our emissions and transforming our economies and our societies. One of them, on carbon dioxide removal, is undoubtedly something we will have to tackle to give us a chance of really staying below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. Solar radiation management or modification, or whatever you term you want to use, is a very different type of challenge. And I think it's one that we have not at all started to address in a multilateral setting. It's not one, I don't think, which we are equipped to deal with at the moment. There have been a number of conversations over the years in how might you start to look at the management of at least the research agenda in this field. And clearly a great deal of research is underway, and that is reflected in the type of papers and studies which the IPCC is picking up and reviewing in the context of AR6 and its work. And it will be interesting to see the state of knowledge which we can get when the AR6 comes out. But there's certainly no single place where these different technologies have been looked at and thought through. And they, particularly if you start to think about putting aerosols into the atmosphere, or trying to change the degree of reflection of clouds, we're talking about totally different governance issues. They go beyond national boundaries in a way which we've not been at all good in tackling within the climate field in the past. We've based our policies on national types of action. These type of technologies are by their very nature transboundary. They raise many, many issues of that sort, which I think we're ill-equipped at the moment to tackle.
I mean, do we have existing fora and processes which could be the basis of having these discussions, or are we talking about completely new ones that might be needed?
I mean, I know there have been attempts to begin conversations on looking at this, particularly in the UN Environment Assembly, which did not reach agreement when it looked at this a year or so ago. This is somewhere I don't think there is a natural home for at the moment. I don't feel myself, and this is a personal view, that it's something we could really pick up and work with well under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement sets us temperature goals, and you could argue that these methods are about temperature control. But they take us into so many different issues of well, I mentioned equity before, but I mean, certainly you're talking about long-term reliability of these methods. You're talking about the impacts which potentially are disrupting the climate in their own right, an impact on rainfall patterns, impacts around the world, and serious problems in case of if we don't maintain these technologies and these interventions over time. Those are the type of challenges which we've not had to deal with so far, and I think those would require us to think very seriously how and if the international community wanted to manage them. So the easiest way would be to say we don't use them, but I think that's a different type of governance you need.
You used the term equipped a few times. What does that mean in terms of knowledge, or are there other things that I mean, obviously governance as well, but what exactly do you consider to be the sort of equipment that you would be looking for to be able to take these decisions?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not quite sure what type of decisions we're talking about now.
Right.
I think the first thing is, do we have a sort of management of research in this field? I think that is something which is underway at the moment. How far do you take that down the road? To some extent, there are two schools of thought. One is, if you start working on this, it's almost prejudging that you're going to use it. On the other hand, if you don't have the research and the knowledge and the ability to judge what is possible, you could not even take that decision. And you couldn't take a wise decision at a multilateral level. The second one is, what multilateral approaches would you need if you wanted to move into an operational use of these technologies? And my personal view is we should not be using those technologies at a large scale and thinking about that. But if we were to go down that road, we would need to create something, because we don't have the type of fora which could manage interventions over a long scale, which are transboundary, multi-generational potentially, by the time you look at the type of timescales which are being thought of for these sort of interventions. Emissions, it's today we emit. If we get to zero, we haven't solved climate change, but we've given us a clear basis for future generations to build their future development. If you start going down the solar radiation management road, you're talking about how long, how is that managed over time. It's a very, very different set of challenges. So I don't think we're equipped at all to handle those sort of issues at the current time.
Some people have described this era as the Anthropocene, which human activity is the dominant influence on climate ecosystems, and suggest that requires a new kind of approach and way of thinking about how we address that. Do you see that as a meaningful idea? And do you see the multilateral system sort of realizing that we're in this period? Is it capable of adjusting to this kind of new phase, whatever the Anthropocene brings with it?
Well, I think you can understand the Anthropocene in several different ways. You can see it as a statement of fact that human activity has now become a force at the level of the planet. That's climate change. It's also our impact on the ozone layer, our impact on biodiversity, the sheer quantity of material that humans are using around the world. We've become a geological force, and that will be seen in future generations, potentially in thousands or even millions of years. You could identify this period. That's a statement of fact. It's an analysis of the situation we're in. I think there's another set of ideas, which is, do we as humanity decide actively to intervene to manage the planet in this way? And I think that's a choice as to whether we want to go down that road or not. We can go to try to limit our impact on the planet, to live within the planetary boundaries. And that is one option we can take for sobriety, for a way of living, organizing our societies, which allows us to stay within those boundaries and meet the essential needs of our populations in coming generations. Another way would see us actively intervening to manage what those boundaries are. We can't change them fundamentally, but we could change the way in which they interact. And I think solar radiation management in particular is taking us into that way. It's the desire to use a sort of enormous power of science and technology to manage the planet actively. That's a very different set of choices for the future of humanity. My preference is for the first one and not for the second one. That's a personal view as to where I would like us to go. And I think if humanity chose to go down the road of actively managing the way the planet works, that's a very different set of institutions we would need. My own view, you started off by, degrading our current multilateral system in responding to the climate crisis. Our ability to work as a multilateral community, multilateralism, international law, they're essential, but they're very difficult tools to make work. And I would be extremely doubtful our ability to have that level of cooperation to manage that sort of intervention over time, which means that I think we have to go down the road of the living within the limits. It is the Anthropocene because we have had those impacts. We have to find a way of living with it and changing the way that our societies and economies work. The other option is there. I think it raises real questions of whether it could possibly work, and I would be extremely doubtful of that approach.
So you mentioned these two broad potential approaches, and to what degree I mean, how do people actually take a decision? You mentioned your preference, but how do other people take a decision as to which broad approach to take? To what degree is this something that science can help determine, or do other considerations have to play a part as well, ethical, cultural, religious? And how do all these various things come together to help somebody say, no, I think we should go this way or this way on such a fundamental question?
I think it is it's an extremely good question, and I don't have an answer. There's certainly not an easy answer to that. We could talk for hours to try and get to grips with it. I think it is not a scientific statement, here is what we can do, and therefore we take it forward. A sort of very technocratic way of seeing it is not going to work. This raises serious ethical issues about how we live on our planet. What is a good life for each of us in the decades to come, or for future generations that we leave behind in terms of the options for those future generations? And coming back to the intergenerational equity I raised earlier in our conversation, we cannot avoid those questions. They're ones which are very, very hard to have in a political system which is so dominated by short-termism. We're not equipped by our political systems, even at a national level, to have conversations which take us much beyond 10 or 15 years in the future. And most of the time, we're looking on a 3, 4, 5-year electoral timescale, which most politicians are thinking of, and most of our debates are thinking of. These put us onto generational or even secular timescales. I don't think we've ever had to have that sort of conversation and think about how to manage those changes over such a long time. Climate change and the other issues we're now facing, biodiversity loss and other challenges of managing the planetary boundaries, are going to make us think about these. And I think we will have to think at a national level, how do we bring these into our institutional, even constitutional ways of thinking about the impacts on future generations? Yes, the scientific community can give us some of that. Yes, and we've seen it in the last few years with the major impact of youth movements saying, people who are 15 or 16 talking about their future in 50 or 60 years' time. But even that is probably not enough for us to structure these conversations. We will need to think of some ways of doing that. I don't have an easy answer to it, but it will take us into very deep ethical issues, which we don't have a lot of experience of handling well.
I could just finish on a final question about the nature of hope. It's something that people often talk about in climate communications, and sometimes in a simplistic way and sometimes in a complicated way, in the sense of whether you need hope or not, and how you might maintain hope, but whilst also being honest about the scale and nature of the challenge, i.e. not slipping into what some describe as hopium or a more simplistic view of hope. How do you manage that emotionally? What do you suggest to other people working in these difficult areas? How you keep realism and enthusiasm and hope going together?
Okay. I mean, it's true when you spend a lot of time working on climate change and you read a number of reports which set out what some of the impacts could be and the choices it leaves, particularly for future generations, but sometimes even for the next 10 or 15 years and the risks we're facing, it can be a bit depressing. You can come out of this thinking, there's nothing we can do. I don't think that's helpful. And I don't think I'm sometimes asked, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? I don't think those words are helpful. I think the question is, what can we do? How can we deliver? How can we act? That has to be the focus for each of us as we move forward. It's not about hopeful or not hopeful. It's about being very honest about what the situation is and determined to make a difference. I think that is the approach we need to keep. That's why we need to focus for the moment on strengthening the action we've begun. It's nowhere near enough. We need to go much faster and accelerate it. We need to prepare, I think that's our first stage of our conversation, the type of changes, the type of techniques we will need to use in the coming decades. And we need to think honestly about the type of changes in the challenges we may have to deal with in the future, and how potentially we can avoid them. So it's an honesty, I think, is the best way forward. Honesty is not always easy. Sometimes it is rather hard to look in the face of the challenges in front of us. But if we look at them in that way, we can start to address the solutions. So focus on the solutions, focus on what we can do, and double down on action.
Paul Watkinson, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you for the chance to have this conversation.